I stared at Nate's pale face, tubes snaking from his frail body. His hateful words echoed in my mind. "You'll regret this, you worthless excuse for a mother." I couldn't bear it anymore. A smile crept across my lips as a realization washed over me. "Nate, I've been your stepmother, your caregiver, but today I'm done." For years, I had endured the relentless torment from my ungrateful husband, Mark, and his son, Nate. Mark, a failed writer, constantly demanded I leverage my success as a romance novelist to pitch his sloppy manuscripts to my publisher. Ignoring basic writing rules, he expected me to pave his way, riding on my coattails. Nate was no better. The 16-year-old brat, failing in school, would demand my assistance with his homework, only to mock my profession as trashy romance. His malicious attitude was a constant source of stress, yet Mark turned a blind eye, enabling his son's disrespect. The betrayal ran deeper than I realized. One fateful day, I discovered Mark had been submitting his manuscripts as my own, causing professional havoc. When I confronted him, he dismissed my anger with a wave of his hand, and Nate celebrated his father's deceit openly. I had contemplated leaving, but the fear of damaging my reputation and disappointing my parents held me back. That all changed when Nate got into a severe car accident. As I tended to him in the hospital, he continued his verbal abuse, demanding I pay his medical bills. Nate's aggressive demands and Mark's financial irresponsibility pushed me to my limit. I decided to act decisively, contacting a lawyer to start divorce proceedings and disengage from funding Nate's treatment. No more would I be the doormat for their entitled behavior. I had spent years catering to their every whim, sacrificing my happiness for their selfish needs. But not anymore. It was time to reclaim my life, my dignity, and my freedom. As I stood firm in my decision, Mark's desperation grew more apparent. He would stop at nothing to maintain his parasitic grip on my life and success. "Kelly, please reconsider," he begged, his voice dripping with feigned sincerity. "Think about how this will affect Nate's recovery." I scoffed at his manipulation tactics. "You mean the recovery you can't afford because you've been leeching off my earnings for years?" Mark's eyes narrowed, and he dropped the charade. "Don't act so high and mighty. Without me, you'd be nothing. I'm the real talent in this family." His audacity was staggering. I couldn't help but laugh in his face. "Talent? You call plagiarizing my work and submitting it as your own talent?" Mark recoiled, his cheeks flushing with anger. "How dare you accuse me of such a thing?" I pulled out a stack of printed emails, manuscript drafts, and submission records, slamming them on the table. "The evidence speaks for itself, Mark. You've been passing off my work as yours, jeopardizing my career and reputation." Silence hung heavy in the air as Mark's gaze fell to the damning papers. He knew he was caught, but his ego wouldn't let him admit defeat. "You ungrateful witch," he spat. "After everything I've done for you, this is how you repay me?" I shook my head in disbelief. "Everything you've done for me? You mean exploiting my success, mooching off my hard work, and enabling your son's disrespectful behavior towards me?" Mark's face contorted with rage, but before he could respond, Nate's voice cut through the tension. "Don't listen to her, Dad," he sneered from his hospital bed. "She's just a bitter, jealous hag who can't handle real talent." I turned to face the source of so much torment, finally finding the courage to stand up to him. "Talent? You're one to talk, Nate. You're failing in school, disrespecting your elders, and expecting everyone to clean up your messes." Nate's eyes widened in disbelief, clearly unaccustomed to someone challenging his entitled behavior. "How dare you speak to me like that?" he snarled. "Do you have any idea how much my medical bills are costing? You'll pay for this, you washed-up hack!" I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of his threats. For too long I had cowered under their intimidation, but no more. "Pay for it?" I retorted, my voice steady and defiant. "I've already paid enough, Nate. I've paid with years of emotional abuse, financial exploitation, and a complete disregard for my well-being." I turned to Mark, my resolve unwavering. "The divorce papers are being filed, and I'm cutting off all financial support. You two can figure out how to solve your problems without my help." As I walked out of that hospital room, a weight lifted from my shoulders. The shackles of their oppression had been broken, and I was finally free. In the days following my confrontation with Mark and Nate, my resolve only strengthened. I gathered every shred of evidence, documenting their deceit and abuse with meticulous detail. As I pored over the paper trail, the depth of their betrayal became increasingly apparent. Emails, draft manuscripts, even plagiarized passages from my published works, it was all there, a damning indictment of their selfish exploitation. I couldn't believe how blind I had been, allowing them to take advantage of me for so long. But no more. This time, I held all the cards. The divorce proceedings moved swiftly, and Mark's attempts at reconciliation grew increasingly desperate. "Kelly, please, think about what you're doing," he pleaded over the phone. "This will ruin us financially. We need your income." I couldn't help but laugh at his audacity. "My income? You mean the one you've been stealing from by passing off my work as your own?" There was a pause on the other end, and I could almost hear the gears turning in his head as he searched for another manipulative tactic. "What about Nate?" he finally said. "He needs you, Kelly. You're like a mother to him." My blood boiled at the mention of that ungrateful brat's name. A mother? Is that what he calls me when he's berating me, mocking my career, and demanding I foot his bills? Mark's voice took on a pleading tone. "He's just a kid, Kelly. He doesn't mean it. We're a family, and families stick together." I couldn't believe the nerve of this man. "A family? You two have done nothing but tear me down and use me as a meal ticket." Well, no more. Before he could respond, I hung up the phone, severing that toxic line of communication. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of legal proceedings, and Mark's desperation turned to bitterness. Nate, ever the obedient son, followed suit, lashing out with venomous insults and threats whenever he could. "You're making a huge mistake, Kelly," Nate spat during one of his physical therapy sessions. "Dad and I will make sure you regret this." I simply smiled and shook my head. "Regret? Nate, the only thing I regret is not doing this sooner." His face contorted with rage, but I remained unfazed. Their threats and tantrums no longer held any power over me. As the court date loomed, I felt a sense of empowerment I had never experienced before. For years, I had been the victim, but now, armed with the truth and supported by an unwavering legal team, the tables had turned. When the day finally arrived, I walked into that courtroom with my head held high, ready to face my tormentors and reclaim what was rightfully mine: my dignity, my success, and my freedom. The weeks leading up to Nate's accident were a whirlwind of emotions. As the court date approached, the tension in our household was palpable. Mark and Nate seemed to take turns lashing out at me, their frustration boiling over as the reality of their impending downfall set in. "You're making a huge mistake," Mark would snarl, his face contorted with rage. "Do you really think a judge will side with you over your own family?" I would simply shake my head and walk away, refusing to engage with his baseless threats. I had the evidence, the truth, and a team of skilled lawyers on my side. Their desperate attempts at intimidation held no sway over me. Nate, ever the obedient son, followed his father's lead, hurling insults and accusations whenever our paths crossed. "You're a selfish, pathetic excuse for a woman," he spat one day as I passed by his room. "Dad and I are the real talents in this family. Without us, you'd be nothing." I couldn't help but laugh at the irony of his words. For years, they had leeched off my success, plagiarizing my work and exploiting my earnings. And now they had the audacity to claim they were the ones responsible for my achievements. As the court date drew nearer, Nate's behavior became increasingly erratic. He would disappear for hours on end, returning home in a foul mood, reeking of alcohol and defiance. "Where have you been?" I demanded one night as he stumbled through the front door, his eyes glazed over. "None of your business, you miserable hag," he slurred, shoving past me and nearly knocking me over. I wanted to say something to put him in his place, but the words caught in my throat. A part of me still clung to the hope that he would come to his senses, that the boy I had tried so hard to nurture was still somewhere inside that bitter shell. But that hope was shattered the night of his accident. I'll never forget the sound of screeching tires and twisting metal that echoed through the neighborhood. When the police officer showed up at our door, delivering the news that Nate had been in a severe car crash, my heart sank. As I rushed to the hospital, a part of me couldn't help but feel guilty, wondering if the stress of the impending divorce had played a role in his reckless behavior that night. But those thoughts were quickly extinguished the moment I stepped into his hospital room and saw the same look of disdain in his eyes. Well, if it isn't the wicked stepmother herself," he sneered, his voice hoarse from the accident. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for the onslaught of abuse I knew was coming. "Nate, I'm just glad you're alive," I said, trying to maintain a calm demeanor. He let out a harsh laugh that quickly devolved into a pained cough. "Alive? For now, maybe. But with the medical bills piling up, Who knows how long that'll last without your precious income to support me? I could feel the anger rising within me, but I pushed it down, determined not to let him bait me into a confrontation. We'll figure it out, Nate, I said, forcing a smile. Right now, all that matters is your recovery. But as the words left my lips, I knew they were a lie. The time for placating him and Mark was over. The court date was just days away, and I had made my decision. No more would I be their doormat, their meal ticket, or their emotional punching bag. It was time to take back control of my life, no matter the cost. In the days following Nate's accident, the hospital room became a battleground. Every time I visited, he and Mark would unleash a barrage of demands and insults, each one more outrageous than the last. You need to start paying his medical bills, Mark would declare, his voice tinged with desperation. We're family, Kelly. You can't just abandon us like this. I would simply shake my head, refusing to be swayed by his manipulation tactics. I'm not abandoning anyone, Mark. I'm just no longer enabling your toxic behavior. Nate, ever the obedient son, would chime in with his usual venom. Listen to my dad, you selfish bitch. If you don't start coughing up the cash, I'll make sure you regret it. His threats, once so intimidating, now rang hollow. I had faced down their abuse for too long, and I was finally free from their grip. As the court date loomed closer, their desperation reached new heights. Mark would call me incessantly, begging and pleading for me to reconsider. Nate would hurl insults and accusations, his anger fueled by the realization that his free ride was coming to an end. But I remained steadfast, my resolve unwavering. I had spent years sacrificing my happiness for their selfish needs, and I was done being their emotional and financial punching bag. The night before the court date, I sat down and wrote a letter to Nate and Mark, pouring my heart out one last time. For too long, I've allowed your toxic behavior to dictate my life, I wrote. You've taken advantage of my kindness, exploited my success, and treated me with nothing but contempt and disrespect. I could feel the weight lifting from my shoulders with every word. But no more. Tomorrow, I'm taking back control of my life, my dignity, and my future. I'm no longer going to be your doormat or your meal ticket. As I sealed the envelope, I felt a sense of empowerment I had never known before. Tomorrow, the scales of justice would finally tip in my favor, and Mark and Nate would face the consequences of their actions. The next morning, I stepped into the courtroom with my head held high, surrounded by a team of skilled lawyers and armed with a mountain of evidence. As Mark and Nate were brought in, their usual bravado was nowhere to be seen, replaced by a palpable sense of fear and desperation. The proceedings were swift and decisive. My legal team presented a clear and concise case, laying out the years of emotional abuse, financial exploitation, and plagiarism. Mark and Nate's attempts at defense were feeble and unconvincing, their lies and manipulations no match for the cold, hard truth. As the judge rendered his verdict, I could see the realization dawning on their faces. They had lost, and their reign of terror was finally over. Miss Thompson, the judge said, his voice ringing with authority, based on the overwhelming evidence presented, the court has no choice but to grant your request for a full separation of assets and alimony. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. A weight finally lifted from my shoulders. As the bailiffs escorted Mark and Nate from the courtroom, their protests and insults falling on deaf ears, I couldn't help but smile. It was over. The nightmare was finally over, and I was free to start a new chapter in my life, one free from their toxic influence. As I stepped out into the sunshine, I took a deep breath, savoring the sweet taste of victory and the promise of a brighter tomorrow. The days following the court ruling were a whirlwind of activity. With the divorce finalized and the separation of assets underway, Mark and Nate were scrambling to salvage what little they had left. Of course, their desperation led them to make one last pathetic attempt at manipulation. Kelly, please reconsider, Mark begged over the phone, his voice trembling with false sincerity. We can work this out, I promise. Just give me another chance. I couldn't help but laugh at his audacity. Another chance? Mark, you've had more chances than you deserve. It's over. There was a long pause on the other end, and I could almost hear the gears turning in his head as he searched for another angle. What about Nate? He finally said, his tone shifting to one of concern. He's just a kid, Kelly. He needs you. I scoffed at the absurdity of his words. Needs me? Nate has made it abundantly clear how little he needs or wants me in his life. As if on cue, Nate's voice chimed in from the background, a string of expletives and insults that only reinforced my point. See? I said. my voice calm and resolved. He's made his choice, Mark. Now it's time for you both to face the consequences. With those words, I ended the call, severing that toxic line of communication once and for all. In the following weeks, the true extent of Mark and Nate's downfall began to unfold. With my income and assets no longer available to them, their facade of success quickly crumbled. Mark lost his job, his employer finally growing tired of his empty promises and shoddy work. Nate, faced with the reality of having to fend for himself, lashed out in anger, his once entitled attitude replaced by a bitter resentment. It was during this tumultuous time that an unexpected ally emerged, my father, John. A retired executive with a vast network of influential connections, he had been a silent witness to my ordeal, offering emotional support and guidance when I needed it most. But now he decided to take a more active role. "They've taken advantage of you for far too long, Kelly," he said, his voice stern but laced with concern. "It's time they face the consequences of their actions." With a few well-placed phone calls, my father set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately seal Mark and Nate's fate. Mark's former employer, already disgruntled by his behavior, received a litany of damning reports and testimonials, all detailing his plagiarism and deceit. Within days, he was not only fired but blacklisted from the industry, his reputation in tatters. Nate, still recovering from his accident, found himself facing a harsh reality. With my financial support gone and his father's income evaporating, the prospect of adequate medical care and rehabilitation grew increasingly dim. It was during one of his physical therapy sessions that the weight of his actions finally hit him. "What have I done?" he muttered, his voice small and defeated. "I've burned every bridge, and now I have nothing." As he sat there, surrounded by the consequences of his own entitled behavior, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of pity. But that pity was quickly overshadowed by a sense of vindication, a validation that my decision to break free had been the right one. In the following months, Mark and Nate's lives spiraled further into chaos, their once comfortable existence reduced to a struggle for survival. And through it all, I remained steadfast, rebuilding my life and embracing the freedom I had fought so hard for. As I looked back on that tumultuous chapter, I felt a sense of pride and empowerment. I had faced down my tormentors, endured their abuse, and emerged victorious. And while their downfall was of their own making, I couldn't help but relish in the sweet taste of karmic justice. As the dust settled from the initial legal battle, I knew the war was far from over. Mark and Nate, backed into a corner and faced with the harsh realities of their actions, were bound to lash out one last time. And sure enough, their final act of desperation came in the form of a countersuit. "You can't just take everything from us," Mark spat, his voice dripping with venom as we stood before the judge. "We're entitled to a share of your success, your assets, everything." I couldn't help but shake my head in disbelief. Even after everything, they still clung to the delusion that my achievements were somehow theirs to claim. My lawyer, a skilled and seasoned professional, stepped forward and presented our case with unwavering confidence. "Your Honor, the evidence speaks for itself," he stated, gesturing to the stacks of documents and records that had been meticulously compiled. "For years, Mr. Thompson and his son have engaged in a pattern of emotional abuse, financial exploitation, and outright plagiarism." He paused, letting the weight of those words sink in before continuing. "Not only have they leached off of Miss Thompson's hard-earned success, but they've also actively sought to undermine her career and reputation by passing off her work as their own. They have no legal or moral claim to any of her assets or earnings." Mark and Nate shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their usual bravado deflated in the face of such damning evidence. As the proceedings continued, witness after witness took the stand, corroborating my account and painting a clear picture of the mistreatment I had endured. My publisher, my editors, even former colleagues, all testified to Mark's shoddy writing and his desperate attempts to ride on my coattails. Nate's teachers and school administrators spoke of his dismal academic performance and his entitled, disrespectful behavior towards authority figures. With each testimony, the noose around Mark and Nate's necks tightened, their once confident demeanor crumbling as the truth was laid bare. Finally, it was my turn to take the stand. As I recounted the years of emotional and financial abuse, the courtroom fell into a hushed silence, the gravity of my words weighing heavily on all in attendance. I spoke of the constant belittling and mockery, the demands for financial support, and the outright theft of my intellectual property. I described the countless sacrifices I had made, the dreams I had put on hold, all in the hopes of maintaining some semblance of a family, only to be met with contempt and manipulation at every turn. By the time I had finished, there was not a dry eye in the room, save for Mark and Nate, who sat stone-faced, their eyes burning with hatred. In the end, the judge's ruling was swift and decisive. Based on the overwhelming evidence presented, this court finds no merit in the countersuit, he declared, his voice ringing with finality. Furthermore, we are awarding Miss Thompson full alimony and a substantial sum in punitive damages for the emotional and professional distress she has endured. As the gavel struck, a wave of relief washed over me. It was finally over, the lies, the manipulation, the constant battle for my dignity. I had won, and Mark and Nate were left to face the consequences of their actions. As we exited the courtroom, I caught a glimpse of them, huddled together and whispering furiously. Nate's eyes met mine, and for a brief moment I saw a flicker of realization, a silent acknowledgement of the gravity of his mistakes. But it was too little, too late. The damage had been done, and the only path forward for them was one of harsh lessons and humbling realities. For me, however, the future had never looked brighter. With the weight of their oppression lifted, I was free to embrace a new chapter in my life, one filled with possibilities and the hard-won freedom I had fought so fiercely for. The morning after the final court ruling, I awoke to a sense of liberation I had never experienced before. For the first time in years, I was truly free. Free from the burden of Mark and Nate's toxic influence, free from the constant demands and emotional abuse, and free to live life on my own terms. As I sipped my coffee on the patio, basking in the warm morning sun, I couldn't help but reflect on the tumultuous journey that had brought me to this moment. The years of sacrifice, the emotional turmoil, the legal battles, it had all been worth it to reclaim my dignity and independence. With Mark and Nate's poisonous presence finally excised from my life, a newfound sense of empowerment washed over me. I was in control now, the master of my own destiny, and the possibilities were endless. Over the next few months, I embraced this newfound freedom with open arms. I traveled to exotic locations, soaking in the sights and sounds that would inspire my next literary masterpiece. I indulged in hobbies and passions that had been neglected for far too long, rediscovering the simple joys that Mark and Nate had drained from my life. Wherever I went, I carried with me a sense of pride and accomplishment, a testament to my resilience and unwavering spirit. No longer was I the downtrodden victim, but a survivor, a warrior who had faced down her oppressors and emerged victorious. Of course, there were moments when the echoes of my past would creep in, uninvited whispers of doubt and insecurity, but I quickly learned to silence those voices, to stand tall and bask in the glory of my hard-won freedom. As time passed, the memories of Mark and Nate's cruelty began to fade, replaced by the vibrant tapestry of my new life. Their names, once a source of anguish and torment, became little more than distant specters, ghosts of a past I had left firmly behind. On the rare occasions when I did catch glimpses of their lives, it was through fleeting news reports or whispered gossip, painting a picture of two men brought low by their own hubris and entitlement. Their fall from grace, once a source of vindication, now elicited little more than a passing shrug, a reminder of the consequences of their actions, but nothing more. As for me, my focus remained steadfastly on the future, a future brimming with promise and possibility. I poured my heart and soul into my writing, crafting tales of strength and resilience that resonated with readers around the world. And in those quiet moments when the weight of my journey truly hit me, I couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the lessons learned, the battles won, and the unbreakable spirit that had carried me through the darkest of times. For too long I had been a prisoner in my own life, shackled by the demands and manipulations of those closest to me. But now, as I stood on the precipice of a new dawn, I was finally free to soar, free to dream, and free to embrace the life fought so hard to reclaim.